That's the conclusion. All right, good. So what's the first premise then that we want to include? Yes.
Everything in motion is put in motion by something already in motion, but that can't continue infinitely, so there must have been something else that started everything.
Okay, that's a pretty good summary of most of the argument. But what's the first premise? Before we even get to all that you said, which is really good, but what's the first point? Yeah. Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Yes.
Oh no.
Okay. Well, tell us anyway. Tell us anyway. What's the first
I
premise?
can guess.
Okay.
Okay, whatever is in motion is put in motion by another.
Okay. Before even that. Yeah.
I was just gonna say maybe that things have potential for motion before they can be put in motion.
Before we even get to that.
Before that?
Yep.
It says that
Things
in
are
the
in
world,
motion.
some things are in motion.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. So before we can even talk about what puts things in motion and potentiality and actuality and all that, in the world, there are things in motion. So right off the bat, we see how this is an a posteriori argument. Right? Here's our observation. There are things moving in the world. Okay, having asserted that, now what's the second premise?
Okay.
Yeah.
Now whatever is moving had to be put in motion by something that was already in motion.
Okay, good. So whatever's in motion is put in motion by another. Very slightly. Whatever is in motion must be put in motion by something else. And then, what does he assert right after that? He asserts a justification for this, right? For, right, we have that word for, which is a premise indicator. Okay, good. For nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that toward which it is in motion, whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in an act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality, but nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in the state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot as fire makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way that a thing should be both moved and mover, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. So what's the last thing he said there?
Motion by another. Moved by something else.
Yeah, so he just reiterated the second premise, right? So everything between those two sentences is simply a justification for this. Something cannot move itself. Something that is actually hot cannot at the same time be potentially hot. Something that is actually moving can't be potentially moving. So something that is potentially moving cannot be actually moving, right? Something can't be in the state of actuality and potentiality at the same time. So if something is merely potentially moving, it can only go to the state of actually moving by something else. That's what all that stuff in the middle is saying. Okay? It's the justification for this. Can we buy this? Does this seem reasonable? Something cannot move itself if it's not already moving. Okay, fair enough. What's the next important premise? Yeah.
That can't go on for infinity.
Okay. So let's paraphrase that. The chain of past movers cannot go back infinitely. And then he gives a reason for that, which we'll return to shortly. So the conclusion that he arrives at,
There must have been God that moved the first.
okay, and what does he call God? The first move. There exists a first mover, which we call God. So God is the unmoved mover. There must be something to get this whole chain started. And everybody at Aquinas says allows that this would be God. Everybody understands to be God. All right, we'll come back to evaluating this in a minute. Let's move to the argument from efficient cause. Because it's so similar, it's worth, I think, discussing them at the same time. Let's remind ourselves from last time, what is an efficient cause?
What makes the thing?
Yeah, what creates a thing, good. So what's the first point then that he makes this argument?
Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself.
Before that. We're skipping.
There's an order of the
Okay, good. So once again, he begins this argument by making an empirical observation, an a posteriori claim. Okay. So premise one: in the world, there is an order of efficient causes. My wife has a donut policy for when that happens. Cell phone goes off, you have to bring donuts to everybody. Next month. But her classes are a lot smaller than mine. That bankrupt her, right? Maybe I should have a Leibniz cookie policy. Your cell phone goes off, you have to bring Leibniz, you have to go to Macy's and buy Leibniz cookies for everyone. That'd be a lot cheaper. What does that mean? In the world, there's an order of efficient causes. Somebody who hasn't spoken.
Oh,
Okay. Let's get more people. Someone who hasn't spoken this semester. How's that? I think I'm being recorded today. I would have dressed better if I'd known that.
Oh, is that for Ben?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? Someone who hasn't spoken this semester. What does that mean? An order of efficient causes. You haven't spoken this semester. Yes, you.
Just that, there's like a line of things that come from something else.
Okay. So illustrate that.
Like, I don't know, shoot, the words escape me. Like, baby puppies come from mommy puppies.
Okay. And where did the mommy puppies come from?
Another mommy puppy.
Which came from?
Another.
Right. And so that's an order of efficient causes, right? What exists now is created by something else, was created by something else, was created by something. So once again, we're thinking back into the past here, except instead of thinking of things in motion, now we're thinking about an order of efficient causes. Okay? Good. That's the first point. Next. Yeah, nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. nothing can bring itself into being. Why is that?
Does it have to be prior to itself? Which is
Yeah.
impossible.
Right, good. It would have to exist prior to itself, which of course is impossible. Okay. Next point.
Kind of the same thing that it can't go on for infinity.
Right.
Efficient cause.
Good. So now in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity. And then he gives an argument for that, which we'll return to in a minute. So, paraphrasing the chain of past efficient causes cannot go back infinitely. Therefore,
It is necessary to admit first efficient cause, which everyone names God.
yeah. So there exists a first efficient cause. God. So note how the structures of these arguments are almost identical. So make some empirical observation about the world, some a posteriori claim about the world. Nothing can move itself, nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. These chains of past movers and past efficient causes can't go back infinitely, so conclusion, right? All right. Now we need to evaluate the arguments. To evaluate the arguments, we first of all have to determine, what's that?
Validity.
Okay, so you're already assuming that these are deductive arguments, right? Yes, and they are, good. So, once we've established that they are deductive arguments, we have to ask, are these valid? Well, what do you think? How do we test for validity? Let's remind ourselves.
All true premises, true conclusion.
Okay, so be more precise about that. Yeah.
It's a valid argument because we assume all the premises are true and it adds up, our conclusion adds up, but we don't have a way of proving that it's necessarily sound.
Okay, well, let's get to soundness somehow. Okay. So remember that to test for validity, we assume the premises are true, and then ask, must the conclusion be true, right? So, assume in the world, right, these are assumptions right now. Assume that in the world there are things in motion, not a hard thing to assume, right? And let's assume that whatever's in motion must be put in motion by something else. And assume that the chain of past movers cannot go back infinitely. Then does it follow that there exists a first mover? Does anybody want to dispute that?
I dispute that he says that it's God, because like, there is clearly something that started it, but
Mhm.
I don't know why you have to draw that conclusion, it's just something we don't know.
Okay. So here, are you good with them up to this point? Got it. Yeah, that's an interesting question. We can get to that in a minute. Let's ignore the parentheses. Do we agree, what's in the parentheses? Do we agree that if the premises are true, the rest of the conclusion must be true?
Yes.
Okay, so if these are true, so valid, right? And what about this one? Same thing?
Yep.
We assume that there's an order of efficient causes and nothing can create itself, and can't go back infinitely, so must be a first efficient cause. Okay, valid, right? Ignoring that. What about the soundness? See, in philosophy, when we're looking at deductive arguments, It's usually the soundness of the arguments that really matters. Yeah.
I think it's not very sound, even the validity could probably be questioned because his premises 3 tears apart his first 2 premises. Because he says this is how it is.
So are you looking at this one?
Yeah, you can look at that.
Okay, let's focus on this one for a minute.
Okay. So his first 2 premises, he's saying this is how things are,
Yeah.
and this is how they've always been. They have to be put in motion by something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then in his 3rd premises, he says, but this can't always be the case. And so to me, that tears apart his first 2, because he's saying this has always been the case. But then he says, but it can't always be the case.
Okay. Say more about that. So you're thinking that there's an inconsistency here.
Yeah, I think he's extremely inconsistent. He's assuming
Mhm.
things have always been in motion, and that they've always been put in motion by something else.
Mm-hmm.
And then in his 3rd premises, he's saying, oh, but we can't assume this has always been the case. In fact, we have to assume that it hasn't always been the case. So to me, that tears apart the entire validity of his argument.
Okay, can we, that's an interesting point. Do you think we can rescue the argument from that? Yeah.
The first 2, oh my gosh, I can't think of the word.
Premises.
Premises, thank you. They say nothing about him assuming that things have always been in motion. He's saying right now, things are in motion.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, this can't have started itself. The 3rd one is the only one that makes an assumption that this motion is infinite, could have been in the past.
Okay. Well, I think the implication here is that no matter how far back we go, if we have something in motion, it must be put in motion by something else, right? And so, suppose that we accept this. Suppose that we accept that there's a first mover. For this to be consistent with this, right? For the conclusion to be consistent with the 2nd premise, what does that say then about the first mover?
That there was nothing moving before.
And
Right.
nothing caused him to move.
And nothing caused it to move, and
So it's not
furthermore,
infinite behind him, he started it.
So
Yeah.
premises
Or
2 has to be
it
false.
started.
assuming what?
Assuming that he was put in motion. Because-
Well, no, not assuming that he was put in motion, assuming that it's moving at all,
Yeah.
right? So, if the first mover is moving, then yeah, there's this inconsistency with the 2nd premise. You're exactly right about that, right? So that might be the first objection. Is that P2 of the argument from motion is inconsistent with the conclusion unless the first mover isn't moving. Yes.
Well, it does say, like, at the end of it, that the first mover was put in motion by no other, implying that, like, somehow it was able to move itself.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So that it's a different nature than what we're aware of.
Yeah. So it's like you're making an exception for the first mover. But then if you're going to make an exception here, why can't you make an exception for other things, right? If you don't make the exception, suppose that you assume that the first mover isn't moving, then that raises the question, well then how does the first mover move anything else? Right? So, yeah, so that's well noted, right? There is this inconsistency. Good. What about this 3rd premise? You like that 3rd premise? Chain of task movers can't go back infinitely? Yeah.
Well, I mean, that only would imply if, like, you believe that time exists, which there's theories that it doesn't, that the universe doesn't have a beginning, in which case it could go back for infinitely, it could just never started.
Okay, well let's look at his argument for this. See what he has to say about it. So this is on page 1 again, fifth line up from the bottom. So this cannot go on to infinity because then there would be no first mover and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only in as much as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. So in other words, what he seems to be saying is this, is to say, well look, suppose that we have a first mover here, and then we have intermediate movers here, and then we have the final thing moved here, right? And what he says is, well look, if there's not a first mover, we get rid of that, then this cannot have been moved and thus be a mover, and hence this cannot have been, and thus this cannot have been, and thus this cannot have been, and hence this cannot have been. But because we have this, we must have this. He makes the exact same move with the argument from efficient causes. Let's look at his reasoning for premise 3 here. This is page 2, first paragraph, fourth line up from the bottom. But in efficient causes, if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause. Neither will there be an ultimate effect nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Sorry, I should have gone up a little higher. Fourth line down from the top. Now in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity because in all efficient causes following an order, the first is the cause of the intermediate and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Okay? So once again, he's saying you've got a first efficient cause here, which causes however many intermediate causes here, and then you've got an ultimate cause right here, which whatever exists now. Now to take away the cause, to take away the effect. So if you get rid of this first efficient cause, if you get rid of this guy, then this could have existed, and if this didn't exist, then this one exists, and if this didn't exist, this one exists, and if this didn't exist, then what exists now wouldn't exist. But because things exist now, there must have been a first efficient cause. So it's the exact same sort of reason, right? What do you think about that? What's that?
I just said it was like the chicken and the egg.
Yeah, kind of like that. Yeah.
Well, if you accept that there's an order of efficient causes, then that would follow.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like it would only be true if you accept the first premise.
Sure. And do you accept the first premise?
In my mind, yeah.
Okay.
And it's just logical to me that that's how.
It's hard to deny it, right? I mean, you were created by your parents, you were created by their parents, right? There's your order of efficient causes.
Right.
And so if you get rid of the first, if you assume there's not a first efficient cause, then what it created couldn't have existed, and so on. There is, I think, an interesting challenge that can be raised here. Well, let's think about it this way. When he says, let's assume there's not a first efficient cause, the assumption is, well, then this doesn't exist. And so we start going this way. But what's another way of thinking about there being no first efficient cause?
That they're just infinite efficient causes.
It's going this way, right? So let's do away with the first efficient cause. Well, yeah, one way of doing that is by knocking it out, but another way is just by adding another efficient cause, and another efficient cause, and another efficient cause. infinitely, right? Same thing here. Get rid of the first mover and these things can't move. Well, no. Another way of getting rid of a first mover is by just adding an infinite number of movers. So the objection goes, look, so long as any individual thing in the chain has something preceding it that either created it or put it in motion, then every single thing has an explanation for it, right? Either for its existence or for its moving. And so he hasn't provided a good reason for accepting premise 3. But, independent of his reasoning, what do you think about premise 3? I mean, really what this comes down to is, can the past be infinite or not? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I have a way of arguing against this.
But against
So-
which? This?
Yes, against.
Well,
the-
wait, let's get back to that.
Well, no, but it has to do with going back infinitely.
Oh, okay, okay.
So, there are things that can put themselves in motion. Like, for example, if I wave my hand, or if I walk across the room,
Mhm.
I'm putting myself in motion. And so if you accept the argument that God created us in his own image, and we can move with our own free will,
Mhm.
then he can move on his own free will.
You're
It's-
just transferring motion though
Yeah.
through your hand.
You're only able to move because your parents could move, like.
Yeah, so this gets tricky, right? What you seem to be denying in this premise 2, which accepts the inconsistency. So now this raises this question, okay, well, what put your hand in motion? Well, your act of willing your hand to go in motion. And what put your act of willing into motion? Well, the states that you were in prior to that put it in motion, and so on and so forth, right? So, yeah, it's kind of hard, I think, to figure out at what level we're going to describe things putting other things into motion.
So it's what created your will to move your hand?
Mm-hmm.
And then what created that will? Probably that will.
Bodies capable of doing
And
it.
now you're going back into the past. But the idea here, okay, suppose that you put your hand into motion. His point is, well, your hand just couldn't go into motion without something doing to it. Right? But what about this inconsistent? Let's talk about this inconsistency for a second. Does the same inconsistency work over here? I don't think so, because this just says nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. That's not inconsistent with the first efficient cause, right? Because God didn't bring him or herself into existence, right? God has just always existed. So there's this is the uncaused cause. This is the unmoved mover, but if God is moving, then you create the problem here. But if God just exists, that's not a problem. This.
Well, it kind of goes with your exception over there, unless the first mover isn't moving, same thing. If the first efficient cause wasn't caused.
Right, right. But see, the assumption here creates problems because if the first mover isn't moving, then how's it moving anything?
That's true.
But here, it's not a problem. Here you've got a God that just has always existed, right? The uncaused cause, and then starts bringing other things into existence. And that's not words, right? Yes.
Unless God was created himself, and therefore.
But that's what this is trying to establish, is that there is an uncaused cause. But now that gets us then back to premise 3. Can you have a chain of infinite past efficient causes? Yeah.
I think an objection to his third premise would be, if a chain of events can't go on infinitely, then how can God go on infinitely?
Okay, there's a concern, right? I think what attracts us to this third premise is it seems odd to think of an infinite past, right? Something that never really got started. And there's this great passage, I'm going to pull this up on the board here. I put this on our class site. last night under the arguments for God's existence thing, under the links. So you can look at this if you'd like. Pull it up on your own. What's happening here? Still turning on. What do you mean you signal? There it goes. Okay, so this is from an article by a philosopher by the name of Jonathan Bennett called The Age and Size of the World. And he writes, Wittgenstein was a 20th century philosopher of language. He writes, Wittgenstein, for some purpose, once invited his hearers to imagine coming upon a man saying, 951413, phew, and then announcing that he had just completed a backward recital of the entire decimal expansion of pi. The conversation might go on like this. All of it? All of it. When did you begin? I didn't begin, of course. I've always been reciting the decimal expansion of pi until just a moment ago when I finished. Thank God. If someone claimed to be embarking on a forward recital of pi, we shouldn't believe him, but we could understand what he said. We can take in the idea of doing so much, then a bit more, and however much he had done, always a bit more still. But the creepiness of Wittgenstein's story suggests that there is a conceptual difficulty in the idea of someone's completing an infinite task upon which he has always been engaged. So I've always been reciting the backward decimal expansion of pi until just now. I just finished it. I never began. I've always been doing it. I just completed it.
No,
That's bizarre.
Never happened.
What's that?
That can never happen.
Why?
Because if it's always expanding, then you can't just start from the beginning.
He didn't start. He's always been doing
Yeah,
it.
he's
That's the
always been
point.
But he himself
That's the
started,
point.
so he was born.
What?
He
No, the
himself-
assumption is he's eternal too. So he's always been doing it.
If it's infinite, you never be able to finish it though.
But he started backwards, so he started.
No, he never started. He's always been
He
doing it.
never started.
Right?
He never
When did you
started.
begin? I didn't begin, of course. I've always been reciting the decimal expansion of pi until just a minute ago when I finished. Yeah.
The perplexing thought is if there's an end, there has to be a beginning.
Yeah. Okay. And isn't that kind of the intuition behind these arguments? That, well, gee, if things exist now, suppose that there is no beginning to it. When did the universe? Well, it's never began, right? The chain of past efficient cause never. It's always been going. To now, right? Now is like this moment is like the ending of the counting the backward decimal expansion of pi. And there's something creepy about that, right? It's like, conceptually, it's hard to wrap your mind around that. Things can't always have been moving, right, infinitely into the past, and then terminating in the present moment. But now, wait a minute. Someone said just a minute ago something about God, right? What was it? Yeah.
That is, if nothing can go on infinitely, then how can God go on infinitely?
Okay. So we've got this mystery here, right? This mystery about an infinite past. But if we put God at the beginning, well, presumably as either the first mover or the first efficient God, no, I'm sorry, first efficient cause, okay, well then, this being then has always existed. And that's mysterious, right? So either way you go here, you've got some mystery. You've either got the mystery of an infinite universe or an infinite God, right, going back infinitely into the past. So God has always been contemplating the mysteries of himself or something right up to this moment. Well, when did you begin? I never began, of course. I've always been doing it. Right up to this moment. And that's creepy, right? I mean, just as this is creepy. That's, I mean, creepy in a, wow, how do you wrap your mind around that sort of sense? Yeah.
Well, what's really weird to think about is, since our memories can only go back so far, we've always been living. Like, we never started living. We can't, like, process that idea of starting to live. We've just always been living in our own, minds.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting the way that our minds work too, because it's hard to imagine what it's like to be dead, because whenever you try to imagine that, you always get in the way. Right? There's been speculation, well, perhaps that's where the idea of an afterlife comes from, is just the impossibility of getting rid of what philosophers call the indexical. So trying to get rid of you out of the equation. Same sort of thing here. But yeah, there's kind of a lesson here to be taken from this. In the history of philosophy, going all the way back to Thales, there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, you run into some mystery that I can't solve, so plug God into it and that solves the problem, right? Because, well, God is mysterious and ineffable, right? Can't be explained, and so there you go. Well, that doesn't get rid of the mystery, it just pushes it onto God. Same sort of thing here. Well, maybe you're satisfied with that, maybe you're not, right? Maybe you're satisfied, right? Maybe you're content with saying, well, God is mysterious, and so if God has always existed, that's more acceptable to me than saying that the universe has always existed. Now, you raised the question earlier, you don't like the idea of the first sufficient cause being God, or the first mover being God. I mean, that's an assumption. Okay, fair enough. But let's buy that assumption. And let's be very careful now about thinking, what exactly does these arguments prove? In other words, let me restate that. Let's assume that the first sufficient cause is God. Let's assume that the first mover is God. Do these arguments prove that God exists? Now you're going to say no because you think this isn't valid. Okay, focus on this argument. Does this argument prove that God exists? What? Who said that? What?
That he existed at one time, but he might not.
Ah. Okay. So at best, don't these arguments establish that God existed?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, this is entirely consistent with God having once existed and then destroying him or herself in the act of creating everything else.
Yeah,
That's not saying that's plausible. I'm not saying it's what happened. It's just consistent with it. So the argument doesn't go far enough, right? If you're going to buy this argument, we need something more. We need the idea that God is a necessary being. That not only did God once exist, but God must have existed, must exist now, must always exist. And that's what Aquinas tries to give us in the third argument, the argument from possibility and necessity. We'll get to that on Friday. I'm going to leave you, so long as we're talking about infinity, I'm going to leave you with a story. Suppose that there's a man driving along the highway late at night, and he's getting tired and decides to pull off for the night. So he pulls off at the next exit, and there's a motel there called the Infinity Hotel. And it's called the Infinity Hotel because it has an infinite number of hotel rooms. So he goes to the front desk and he asks the clerk, do you have any rooms open? And the clerk says, no, I'm sorry, we've had an infinite number of guests coming tonight. All of our rooms are full. And the man says, well, that's okay. Just have everybody move down a room. I'll take the first one. That's the mysteriousness of infinity. All right, have a good day. We'll see you on Friday.